Hello, welcome to Bare Metal Machine. I'm Jeff Audia. Today I'm going to demonstrate how to install a motor adapter to interface a stepper motor to the popular Phase II 8-inch rotary table. And now here's all the hand tools we should need. A strap wrench, a couple of flat blade screwdrivers, a T-handled 5/32 Allen wrench, a T-handle 3/16, a T-handle 3 millimeters, and an 18mm socket. And that should be everything we need. Okay, so now we've got the rotary table all broken down and the hand crank has been removed along with all of its related apparatus. So we're not going to need the hand crank. Get rid of that. And we're not going to need this backing plate anymore. Okay, get rid of that. We are going to need this thing, and of course the graduated slip ring dial. All right, and here's all the screws and everything left over that we're going to need. And so all of the screws and hardware that was removed we'll be reusing. Okay, so here are all the main components of the adapter. You have the main adapter assembly itself, which is comprised of 4 components. These 2 side plates, this backing plate, and of course the motor plate itself, which happens to be a NEMA 23 style motor plate. Now, the backing plate is really where all the action happens. You have this 1.178 diameter here, which fits snugly on the 1.178 diameter of the eccentric worm support. And the slot here and the screw going through here comprise a clamping action, and so this diameter here clamps down over that worm support snugly. And that's what holds this thing on, and that's actually the main primary effect of this coaxial drive system. This hole here is for the worm clamp. The original design had this lever here, and you could move it up or down to engage or disengage this clamp that held the worm screw still. And it's a very handy feature for holding the worm still so you don't upset the position of the table while you're adjusting your slip ring graduated dial, right? So in the case of the stepper motor interface to this table, that's really important because you don't want to be moving this dial and challenging the motor to hold the table still, all right? So that clamp is actually very handy, although you actually don't need it. You can leave it off the installation if you want, but I highly recommend it. And after all, the graduated slip ring dial is a main feature of this particular type of adapter, and so why even bother with any of this if you're not gonna, go all the way? So I think you should put the clamp on. And okay, so now the motor coupling itself is comprised of 2 components, right? So this is the component that actually interfaces with the worm shaft. Here's your 12mm diameter, which matches this 12mm diameter and the keyway. And then you have the motor coupling itself, and these 2 fit together, very precisely matched. And then of course you include your flex coupling. And so these 3 components are basically your motor coupling to the worm screw. Okay, now let's see. Now this component here fits over this thing that I introduced earlier. All right, and it fits over like that. Now this is just a clearance fit. It doesn't. This diameter isn't really functional. Don't worry if it doesn't really fit precisely. You may actually have to go in and clean out this hole a little bit, buff it out with some Scotch-Brite or some sandpaper and open it up a little bit. It's not important that these things precisely match. This is the real operative diameter. And again, it's just for clearance. And the reason why you might run into difficulties there is because, keep in mind, I don't know the tolerances and specifications that these tables were built to. So I don't know what diameter that thing is ever really ground to. And so I don't know the original tolerance, and it could be anywhere. All right, so don't despair if you need to clean this out a little bit so that these things fit together. Okay, let's begin. So the first thing you should notice about the adapter assembly when you received it is that there's 2 screws on the back of it that are loose. Okay, and the reason for that is that, remember that this 1.178 diameter clamps down around the same diameter on the eccentric worm support. And even though it clamps almost imperceptibly, by squeezing that gap when you tighten the screw, nevertheless, if you had these 2 screws tight, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't tighten properly. So what you want to do is tighten those 2 screws last. And now, notice that there's these 4 screws here on the rear of the eccentric worm support, but I don't include those holes here. And you'll remember that those 4 holes correspond here to the original backing plate. So why aren't they included? The reason is that, pursuant to a comment I made earlier, I don't know all the tolerances and specifications that the table is made to. So for all I know, the next table that comes along, these holes could be 30 degrees from where they are on this one. I don't know where they're going to be. Even if they were 3 degrees different, it might affect the assembly. So I leave the installation of those screws as a user modification option if you really want them, and it might be useful to have them there for really high torque applications if you're using a big motor. But I've been using this table for quite a long time now, machining all sorts of things, and I've never installed those screws. Okay, but if you want to put them in, you can put them in. Now, to begin, just slip the adapter assembly over the eccentric worm support. All right, push it up against that back surface. Get it pretty much level by eye. And then take your 5/32 T-handle and clamp down on it. Now don't be shy, you can clamp right down on this thing pretty hard. You've got an inch of thread engagement down here. And even though it's only a 1032 screw, with that much thread engagement, you can put some force on it. Okay? So now that we're clamped onto our eccentric worm support, now you can go back and tighten up these screws here. Okay? So tighten those down. All right? And notice that the worm engage-disengage effect of the eccentric worm support is still retained in this design. So, the main features of the original design, the worm clamp, the ability to engage or disengage the worm, and the slip ring graduated dial, I've retained all of those features in this design. Okay, next we come to the step that I think is the hardest part of the job, and that's the installation of the worm clamp. Okay, first we install this thing, remember? And don't be afraid to put a little oil on these surfaces, by the way. These are all sliding metal components, okay, and they need lubrication. Now the worm clamp, okay, remember, is this thing, and it fits into this little hole here between those 2 pins. And the pins keep that clamp from rocking in either direction and jamming. Okay. Now, next you have this screw here with this hex fitting on one end, and these like 4mm threads on the other. Okay, and that threads in from the rear. So just screw that in until it stops against the backing plate. And it just stops against the backing plate, and then you're there. Okay, so now I've rotated the table about 90 degrees so I can show what's going on the backing plate here without having to get too fancy with my camera angles. So here's the screw that I was talking about earlier that I put in, and I screwed it in until it just touched the back of the backing plate. Okay, and that hex fitting you see there matches the hex fitting on this lever. So the tricky part, if you could call it that, is to find the sweet spot of how far this thing is threaded in and which one of these hex angles that you go for, so that the clamp is fully disengaged when you want it disengaged and fully engaged when you want it engaged. And that sounds kind of funny, but the fact is that you can't have any drag. If that clamp is dragging at all, this system will not work. So you need to make sure that the clamp is not dragging And so I found that if I just screw this in till it just touches, and then put this in at about, well, looking from the rear, about the 9 o'clock position, right? So that when I let go of it, it's dangling. It's absolutely free. But when I move it up, I can start to feel the clamp engage. And now it's engaged. And then when I disengage it, it's dangling. So it's absolutely free. See? And this thing spins completely free. I want to engage it, right? Push it up, right? And it's nice and tight. And nice and free, absolutely dangling at the 6 o'clock position. And so the tricky part of this whole thing actually is not that, but installing the screw that holds the lever in place. And to do that, I usually put down a rag or something like that, and you have this little 3mm screw and washer that screws into the end of that little hex shaft, and that's what holds the lever on. And honestly, for me, that's the hardest part of the entire job, is not dropping that screw. Okay, so now we can just screw this little screw in tight. Doesn't have to be excruciatingly tight. Right. There it is. So now your clamp is completely installed. It's completely free, and up going towards the 12 o'clock position, it's completely tight. It's perfect. Okay, now I got the table rotated back to the normal position. The rest of the installation is the proverbial cakewalk, whatever that is. So we start by installing this slip ring dial, all right? And it helps if we make a note of where those holes are. And these 4 screws need to go back in. Okay. Link all 4 of these down. Notice that everything's still spinning nice and free, right? There it is. Okay. Okay, next we install the worm shaft coupling, right? So reinstall this spacer. Next, okay. Next, reinstall these 4 long screws. Okay. Oink those down. Okay. Okay, next step, put this nut on. And for this I use a strap wrench, or in some kits you have a tool that I've included that allows you to hold the worm shaft still while you tighten up this nut. Okay? 18mm, and sock down on that thing pretty good. That's good. Doesn't take too much, but you want to sock it down pretty tight. Okay, next we install the motor coupling. Okay. 3/16 T-handle. Okay, now again with the strap wrench. Oink these 4 down. Now, the main reason for the strap wrench, or the tool that holds the worm shaft still while you're doing this, is that you cannot put a tremendous amount of force on the worm and ring gear. For instance, if you just tried to invoke the brakes or hold the table still somehow while you were jacking down on these screws, you'd be putting so much force on the worm gear and the ring gear that you would ruin it. Now the rest is fairly straightforward. Install our spring coupler and our motor plate. Wrong size wrench. There you go. Okay. Tighten these all up. Okay, last but not least, the motor installation. Okay. Point these down. 3 and 4. There it is. Now the motor's all installed. Okay, now the last step would be to tighten up our flex coupling screws. 3 millimeters. Of course, your flex coupling may be different. There it is. Voila. Now, there is one last thing I want to mention. The eccentric worm support you see here, okay, it butts up against the casting. All right, but if I unloosen the clamp for the eccentric worm support that allows me to turn it, well, that also allows the ring gear to push the worm gear out. See the gap there? See this gap? So when I turn the table counterclockwise, it sucks the worm up tight into the casting. You see that? All right. So you want that eccentric worm support sucked up close to the casting, and also you want the eccentric worm engagement apparatus to be rotated fully counterclockwise so that it's up against the pin, the limiting pin that limits the worm and ring engagement, okay? Which is actually adjustable, by the way, for your backlash adjustment. So I turn this thing counterclockwise. I kind of hold it with my thumb up against the limiting pin, and I sort of tug on the table counterclockwise so that the eccentric worm support is sucked up into the casting, and then I apply this clamp, right? That's the final setup. Okay, now we've got the table and the adapter all buttoned up, and the motor is under power. So let's test it out. All right, I'm going to move it some angle here. There we go. Go back again. And now here's where your worm clamp comes in handy. I'll invoke the worm clamp, tighten that thing up. Now I can move the graduated slip ring dial and get it right on 0 so I know that I'm getting home every time. There's a little scribe line here, and there's 0, and I'm right there. Be sure to release the clamp, otherwise the motor will stall and it won't be pretty. Go back to 0. Bam, right there. There it is. That's the complete setup. The motor's under power. It's rotating to angles that I specify, and it's getting back to 0 according to my slip ring dial. And we're good to go. Enjoy. Thanks for watching.